Welcome everyone to this special tribute from the literary community in honor of our dear friend and cultural hero, Geoffrey Ursell. Geoffrey left us on February 21st after living for a long time with Parkinson's. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that while this was a difficult thing to endure, Geoffrey did so with dignity and grace, two qualities that are apt descriptors of Geoffrey's essence, with or without the disease. We're fortunate tonight to have several of Geoffrey's friends and colleagues together to share remembrances of our times with Geoffrey. And how can I not say, and Barbara. Barbara is with us tonight as well, and will speak briefly at the end. It has always been Geoffrey and Barbara, and in so much of what Geoffrey pursued in his life, Barbara was alongside him, and we express our most sincere condolences to Barbara Sapergia at this time. In any case, you'll soon be hearing from Faye Rafter, David Carpenter, Nik Burton, and Robert Currie. We're all coming together from different places and time zones. The Saskatchewan Writers Guild and Sask Books serve a membership spanning the entire province of Saskatchewan in treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, which encompasses the unceded territories of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Dene nations, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The Guild's fortunate to have the support of our major funders who make events like this possible. Sask Lotteries, in proud partnership with Sask Culture, Canada Council for the Arts, and the City of Regina. Sask Books is grateful for the support of Creative Saskatchewan, Canada Council for the Arts, and Canadian Heritage. This event tonight is broadcast across a Zoom webinar platform. So if you'd like to share your reminiscences about Geoffrey, you can do this in one of two ways. You can use the chat function, but you must be sure to choose to send your message to all panelists and attendees rather than only panelists. Other folks will be able to read them there. And we are recording this special event, and your chat comments will be made available at a later time along with the video of this event. The second way to share your thoughts about Geoffrey would be to speak briefly at the end of this formal presentation. And we're going to fit in as many people as we're able to, but our program is only an hour long, so please keep that in mind. Live text captions are available through Zoom. You can turn them off or back on by pressing the closed caption icon on the bottom of the screen. And now on to our first presenter this evening. Faye Rafter was a Coteau Books board member. Initially a librarian at the Regina Public Library, where she headed up the children's department. She then moved to the University of Regina to teach. She's been the executive director of the University of Regina Faculty Association and was an executive with the government of Saskatchewan, later forming her own consulting company. These days, she's still supporting and pursuing the arts, and she volunteers with the Regina Floral Conservatory.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm really pleased to participate in this tribute to Geoffrey. He was a very good friend for many years, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to share a few stories and observations about his life in the company of other friends and in the company of Geoffrey's family and Barbara. I often laughed with Geoffrey about certain characteristics that he had. His gentle demeanor that we all knew was a ruse for a strong and determined person who saw the road forward, but sometimes had to persuade others to follow. As kids, it was called bossy. As adults, it was called vision. He had a head for math and could divide a restaurant bill and assign the tip before you could get your wallet out. And if you thought that his jungle of an office was impenetrable, just ask him for a specific document or a manuscript, and it was quickly retrieved. He was highly organized. In our very early childhood, Geoffrey lived next door. We lived next door to each other, and there were 7 Ursells who, on a daily basis and in varying numbers, would file through our house like a line of ants making their way to my mother's cookie tins. Geoffrey was the eldest. We were always a little afraid of him because he had a quiet authority that seemed to come from some place we didn't really understand. So when his troublesome brothers and I crossed the line, we knew to avoid him. It may not be well known that our seemingly gentle and non-athletic Geoffrey had been a fierce competitor in his youth. A 4 times badminton champion, an excellent golfer, a fastball player, and as well, he was musical and played accompaniment for 2 of his sister's gymnastic events. At the age of 17, he said to one of his sisters that he planned to be a great Canadian writer. And these qualities of competitiveness, dedication, focus, and support were clearly part of his personality that influenced his path into his writing. I met Barbara, and after she and Geoffrey were married, we 3 developed a friendship when we lived next door to each other in Vancouver. We had apartments in adjacent houses. Our buildings were so close together that we could borrow things and throw them through the window. They had wacky, intelligent friends who inspired interesting conversations. And they created a warm and wonderful home where they often invited me to enjoy late rainy afternoons sitting around the fireplace, drinking tea while Geoffrey played guitar and tested out new songs and poetry or just sang. They were kind and fun, and we laughed a lot. Some years later, we found ourselves again living in close proximity to each other, a few houses apart in Regina on McTavish Street, where Coteau held its first book launch. It was such a fabulous event, and maybe a first in Regina, the beginning of something big for Coteau. A few years later, I had the good fortune of joining the Coteau board, where I stayed for 14 or so years and read manuscripts long afterwards. It was through that experience on the board and after that I became more appreciative of Geoffrey's passion and talent for writing prose, music, poetry, and plays. He never stopped, and like other writers, he always had something in the works. His business acumen and his strong support for other writers showed itself in the diversification of Coteau's publishing vision to include children's books, anthologies, catalogs, and other genres which helped to sustain the company and definitely to support writers. But what I didn't fully appreciate until years later was the commitment, the sacrifice, and the resourcefulness that it took to enjoy a sustainable life in the arts without a predictable income. And I didn't fully appreciate the deliberateness and balance it took to lead a productive life while working at home with your partner, who is also a writer. It required a clear sense of purpose, a strong sense of self, and an enormous respect for others. It's this respect that I observed in Geoffrey in his support for other writers during his time as publisher and editor at Coteau and throughout his lifetime. He was enormously talented, creative, and steadfast. And above all, he was a friend. Some years back, when my husband was seriously ill, Geoffrey and Barbara arrived from Saskatoon with a set of my husband's favorite John Field's nocturnes and a poem that Geoffrey had written for him that he read at his bedside. I'm not sure everyone knew this side of Geoffrey. He showed up when needed, and he continued to check in, just in case. Our friendship continued to flow over the years with lots of back and forth, talking about all things that make a conversation. And throughout, he continued to grow as a writer, to contribute to the literary community, and to plan the next project, always enthusiastic about the work he was doing and that which he hoped to do. He never stopped to the very end. Geoffrey's absence has left an indelible mark, both professionally on the writing community and personally as a friend. He will be missed.
Thank you so much, Faye. It was a wonderful way to begin, to be able to go right back to the beginnings of our Geoffrey in Moose Jaw as a child. And you've certainly seen all of his life and some of the wonderful things that have come to pass because he was with us. Our next speaker is David Carpenter, who began writing as a reviewer and translator. During his first year in Saskatoon, he saw a performance of the Moose Jaw movement and resolved to switch lanes and become a writer. He has written and published a dozen books that he admits to, and several more that he doesn't. In this voyage from scholar to writer, Geoffrey Ursell was a big influence.
Can folks hear me out there?
Influence on Carpenter.
Dave, you just have to, there you go. We can hear you.
Okay, very good. I'm a Luddite, the worst of the lot. Faye, that was awfully nice to hear. You really knew Geoffrey and Barbara, of course, as well. You knew them right down to the core. When I first met Geoffrey, I believe he was trying to get me to join the Guild, and I didn't even know what the Guild was. But when I joined the Guild and then met him, really got to know him down at Fort San, I was aware that there could be no two Geoffrey Ursells in the world. For one thing, he looked very scholarly to me, and had found out that he published an article on Joseph Conrad in the Times Literary Supplement. So okay, that's who he is. He's a scholar. And then we created a baseball team. In fact, it went on for several years. And Bob Currie will remember this. We never won a single game, except once when we played the people on the Sindaluta Reserve, and they hit the ball very high and very far. And I was the unfortunate pitcher, but they couldn't hit very slow pitches, and that's all I could throw. But I think we won that one game primarily because Geoffrey Ursell, out I think on left field or center field, could catch these enormously long flies. I've never forgotten that. I learned later he was a terrific golfer and a badminton player and a ping pong player. So that was the first things that I noticed about him. The second thing that came to light was while I was doing a fiction class with Barbara Sapergia, and our guru was either Croach or Hodges, probably Croach. We could hear Geoffrey composing songs in a nearby room. And sometimes after the sessions were over, we all loved to sing. And we would sing Geoffrey Ursell songs. We would sing the Gopher Song, or we would sing God Damn the CPR, or the Scottish Curling Song, or a little later, is anybody here from Moose Jaw? These are classics. These are prairie classics. And I thought, oh, well, maybe he's not very scholarly. Maybe actually his true calling is songwriting. Then the 80s came along, and during the 80s, Geoffrey published, I believe it was 5 books. His award-winning novel, Purdue, and some stories and some poems. One of the poems I read in Saturday Night. But oh, this guy is a literary writer with a wide range of talents, many voices. Along the way, though, I heard that he won awards as a playwright, and he was also a huge community builder, as far as from the Guild to Coteau and much in between. He helped get the Saskatchewan playwrights going, and I was really struck at how he did all of these things so very well. And later on, once he and Currie and their coven down there in Moose Jaw started Coteau Books, he got a reputation as a great publisher. And finally, I wrote a novel. It was my first full-length novel, and I sent it off to McClellan Stewart, and they accepted it. And then Seligman had to come back to me the following week and unaccept it, because as she said, the suits can't sell this one. And so I went to Geoffrey. I knew he'd accept, Cardo would accept me. I knew that. I arrogantly, I handed the manuscript over, thought I was perhaps giving a gift or something like that. And I waited not too long, and Geoffrey phoned me. He said, Carp, I want to talk with you about your manuscript. Oh, he's going to accept me in person. Wow. And he came over to my house, and he had some large foolscap paper in front of him, several sheets of it. And he sat me down, and he spent at least 5, maybe 10 minutes telling me about all the things he liked about my novel. And I thought, oh, he's really read this thing. He's a deep reader. And boy, that's the understatement of the year. And then he spent a much longer time telling me about what he could not abide in my novel, that had to be changed. I had to do better. And he said, he concluded this conversation by saying, if you're willing to work really hard, Carp, someday this manuscript could be a novel to be proud of. And it was very humbling, of course. And I worked hard for a year and a half and brought it back to Coteau. They published it, and it was a wonderful moment to have that book published with Coteau. Well, one question I never asked him during all these amazing things that he did so well was, is there such a thing as a frustration of the multi-talented? That is to say, people who do so many things so well, do they have the kinds of frustrations that I've never experienced? Because I'm more like a milk horse. I have one route, and I couldn't do the things Geoffrey did. I never asked him that question, but doing this tonight that we're doing, it's helped me feel as though Jeff is just a little bit closer to all of us. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was lovely. And yes, you certainly brought out so much about what was special about Geoffrey and his many talents. I'm going to turn now to Nik Burton, who is Saskatchewan-born, and he was journalism trained, as he put it. He was the first executive director of the Saskatchewan Writers Guild. Some of you might not know that, from 1976 to 81. Then he worked as the Literary Arts Co-ordinator for the Saskatchewan Arts Board until 1988, when he moved to Edmonton to be the executive director of the Book Publishers Association of Alberta. There's quite a theme going on here. You can tell what Nik loved to do. Then he returned to Regina in '94, and then he again served for with the Arts Board as, I presume, again, the Literary Arts Coordinator. Well, I know that, I don't have to presume it. And then he became the managing editor of Coteau Books in 1996. He retired from Coteau in 2015 and moved to Vancouver, Vancouver Island, I should say, later that year. And that's where he is right now. So thanks for being with us tonight, Nik.
Thanks very much, Brenda. And I'm very happy to be able to be part of this tribute through the magic of the electronic world. And I appreciate the comments, including Barbara in the process as well. There was a time when we would often suggest that Barb and Jeff was one word. He and Barbara were like my work parents in my career in Saskatchewan. They were president and secretary when I was hired on at the Writers Guild. And Bob Currie, of course, was also part of the committee that hired me. And then there they were, president and secretary at Coteau, bringing me on there in the 90s. And providing the leadership they did for those organizations. Geoffrey went so far as to rearrange the Coteau staff configuration and give up part of his income to make room for me on the staff. So I have a very strong bond with him in those organizations. A strong trait of Geoffrey's, and it's been mentioned a time or two already, is his vision, his and Barbara's vision of what was needed in the Saskatchewan literary community, of what should be done. He listened to ideas, but he always stuck firmly to his vision of what Coteau was there for, when we had a big commercial hit with Gold on Ice, when we would bring in outside consultation to help us discuss the future of Coteau, which we did several times. The advice would often be, the temptation would be, maybe change our direction, publish more kids' books, look for commercial projects, change how we operated. But Geoffrey always stood firm on the literary mandate of the press. He always often seemed to be the eye of the storm that the Saskatchewan literary scene could be in those days. I'll always remember how he was virtually unflappable in the face of both artistic temperaments and bureaucratic folderol. He would bring what sometimes seemed a bemused detachment to any discussion. He'd sit there stroking his beard like Dumbledore, then render a judgment. At Coteau, it was often a Spike and Chester scenario, if you get that reference. We'd be dancing around and firing off ideas, suggestions, harebrained or otherwise, which he'd finally just dispose of with a backhand swipe of a soft snort and a nah. He could seem almost aloof sometimes, but the real truth was his commitment of time and energy, his devotion to Coteau. In fact, he went to the wall for us several times while I was there to save the press when we had our backs against it. He stuck his neck out to keep us out of dire straits. As you've already heard a couple of times, Geoff was a natural creator. Fiction, poetry, plays, songs. He was a natural helper, being the oldest child, it makes sense. He was an intuitive editor and he was committed to Coteau. He wasn't actually a natural publisher. He was doing it because it needed to be done for the community. So he learned from others, and when he had advice he trusted, he stuck with it. Here's an example. Geoff's friend and Coteau's longtime legal advisor, Jim Russell, told him in no uncertain terms that although an author may have a particular idea of how things should go and should have the freedom to do it, the publisher has to at all times consider its responsibilities to all its authors, both current and future. So threatening the existence of the press over a particular issue or a story was simply not a hill to die on. So although Geoff prioritized creative writing and he supported writers, especially Saskatchewan writers, and the creative process overall to the greatest extent possible, he was clear about where to draw the line in acceding to authors' or staff's demands, and was capable in his pleasant way of being Spike and laying down the law. On the later side of the same trait, some publishers somewhere in the late 70s or early 80s maybe, publicly stated that using the color green on a book cover was the kiss of death in terms of sales. I'm not sure exactly how that was arrived at. It was before my time. But Geoff and Barb took that to heart. It took us years to get them to agree to use green on a book cover. Through it all, Geoff always had that easy manner and that sense of humor. I never once saw him angry. He very much had that calm and even folksy touch you saw in his plays and his songs and some of his prose. A gentle, memorable, noble guy, an iron resolve in a velvet smile. Thank you.
Thank you, Nik. One of the things that is unfortunate about having to celebrate Geoffrey or anyone who has passed away during these pandemic times is the stillness, the quiet in getting together. When we attend more public community events, we can hear one another laugh when we remember with fondness the funny things that happened. And we can see one another get tissues out of a purse or, and witness one another's grief. And that's, of course, really difficult to do in this context. But I've had already this evening many laughs and smiles in this tribute, and obviously moments where the heart stops a little. I have an opportunity myself now to just share some of my reflections about Geoffrey in my life. I think in broad terms, I'd say he gave me and so many others opportunities. He was about building up people, building up artists and cultural workers, you know, creating an environment where the arts could thrive. And he did this in the literary community, obviously, but, you know, he was also reaching out within the playwright community, the screenwriters community. He was looking for any and all opportunities to be creative in any platform he could manage to connect with. So both Geoffrey and Barbara were great influences in my life. Geoffrey was a mentor, a colleague, and an inspiration when it came to understanding how being a multidisciplinarian could generate an income and could just simply be an interesting way to live as an artist, and to do it while living in Saskatchewan, that you could have a career in Saskatchewan that was fulfilling and interesting and could be exported to other parts of the country and sometimes exported to other parts of the world. Not speaking of myself personally necessarily, but certainly of some of the talent that has come through Coteau Books. I was just thinking in decades, you know, I first got to know Geoffrey in the late 80s when I was hired to do the promotions for Coteau Books when I was living in Regina. And that was my first glimpse at the inside of a publishing company and what it took, the kind of energy and commitment and creativity it took to make a book happen, to get it out there across the country and beyond. Then in the 90s, I worked for Geoffrey as his right-hand gal, say his Girl Friday comes to mind, when he was the editor of Grain magazine. And I was just filling in when another person couldn't do that job for a while. So I can't remember, I was there for 6, 8 months, 9 months. And watching him be the editor of that magazine was a huge opportunity for growth and learning about, again, the business side of the arts. And it's been alluded to already, Geoffrey's particular abilities, his mind at work in making the business side happen while never forgetting the importance of the excellence in creativity, excellence in writing. I got a personal glimpse at that when I gave him my short story collection in manuscript form and asked for feedback. And I can certainly relate to what David Carpenter said earlier about the wonderful feedback Geoffrey was capable of. Based on his feedback, I made some changes, revisions to my manuscript, and it picked up the John V. Hicks Manuscript Award. And I think I have Geoffrey to thank for giving me a bit of an edge in that production, I guess. And then Cardo published The Maleness of God. So once again, I was connected to Geoffrey and Barbara, and they ensured I had an opportunity again, another opportunity to be mentored by Bonnie Bernard. And then the biggest project I ever did with Geoffrey and Barbara was a TV show for children called Prairie Berry Pie. And it remains one of the most amazing experiences of my life. To think that, you know, we would have the nerve here in Saskatchewan to have a film industry, to have a TV industry, that a couple of amazing creators, Geoffrey and Barbara, could pull together a TV show that I was fortunate to be the lead character in. That would never have happened without Geoffrey's vision and Barbara's vision on that. And then in the 2000s, I was invited to serve on the board of Coteau, so more observation of just how these folks do the amazing work that they do. And I'll end by saying, or at least end about our connection, by saying we became neighbors in 2008. Geoffrey and Barbara's house is just a door or two down from where Arthur and I live here on Moxon Crescent. So we very much have a strong friendship, not just a business relationship. In all these experiences, I always came away feeling richer. I learned so much in each of the scenarios that I mentioned. So I'm going to just close by saying that I will very much miss seeing Geoffrey walking by our front window with his beloved Barbara. And I'll miss his presence in our community, but I'll always be thankful for the huge amount that I learned from him, especially from his determination and his pride in being from Saskatchewan. And our final speaker in our formal part of our program in honor of Geoffrey is his very dear friend, Robert Currie. And I'm sure you'll all know that he's a former Saskatchewan Poet Laureate, the author of 8 books of poetry and 4 of fiction. And along with Geoffrey Ursell and Barbara Sapergia and Gary Highland, he was one of the founders of Coteau Books and served on the board for over 40 years. And so I'll turn it over to Bob.
Thanks very much, Brenda. As you've heard, Geoffrey Ursell accomplished much in his too short life, both with his own writing and as the driving force at Coteau Books along with Barbara. Here are a few memories from the early years at Cardo. After a couple of stapled chapbooks, Cardo started to do real books, beginning with Lois Simme's Ghost House and Nik Burton's Moving In from Paradise. For these, the production moved to Regina, where Geoffrey and Barbara were living. Now, this was long before personal computers, but Barbara had access to a fancy typewriter that could justify margins and produce a typeface that looked as if it came from a real printing press. In fact, that typewriter was located in the provincial library, but a friend smuggled the Ursells in there at night. The work was done on special clay-coated paper, which didn't allow any mistakes. So Geoff was proofing each page as Barbara finished typing it. She typed both manuscripts, and Geoff arranged for them to be printed and bound by a Regina printer. No more staples for us. When the books came out, the Ursells threw a terrific launch party, the one that Faye referred to earlier. And we celebrated Lois and Mick's achievements in a house overflowing with friends and other writers, a crowd of 80, in fact. The Ursells were living in Regina on McTavish Street then, and their house was quickly becoming a warehouse. There were boxes of books everywhere, not just on the bookshelves, but on the floors, behind the doors, on the counters, under the end tables, even under the coffee table in the middle of the living room. One reason there were so many books was that Geoffrey was a genius at writing up grant applications. In fact, he was the one who met with the Arts Board and convinced them that they ought to have a program to support publishing in Saskatchewan. Well, Geoff was always good at getting along with people and working with people. In fact, one of his great successes was a musical he wrote with Barbara and Ken Mitchell. It was called Year of the Moose, and it was a musical history of the city of Moose Jaw. The show was produced for the city's 100th anniversary by Peacock High School, but it featured many adult actors as well as dozens of students. Just a couple of weeks ago, the local paper called it, quote, the perfect celebratory moment of the community's celebrations, unquote. The show was scheduled to run Thursday to Saturday, But opening night was so successful that Friday and Saturday were sellouts, and a Sunday performance was added, which also sold out. That was over 3,000 people in 4 nights. Moose Javians loved it, with its memories of dances at Temple Gardens, its satire of a local sportscaster who sometimes forgot to turn on his mic, its song about local policeman Mickey Mackey on his motorcycle, and its showstopper, is anybody here from Moose Jaw? That was a question you might hear in the great outback of Australia, on the highest peak of the Himalayas, even in London's Elephant and Castle from Winston Churchill himself. Heck, even the man in the moon was a Moose Jaw boy who wandered far from home. Now, of course, Geoffrey also wrote many fine pieces on his own. And here's one example, a poem about a Waskasiu attraction of the past from this book. It's called Garbage Pit. In a pit the size of a football field ripped out of the woods by bulldozers, the bears, muzzles down, devour steak bones and fat, fish skin and guts, the leftovers from shack tents and restaurants, cabins and camps. The cars are drawn up in an awkward row, so those who are afraid of bears can watch through windshields, while the brave ones go right to the edge, heads bending over their Kodak brownies to capture the bears in black and white. The father leads the oldest boys and oldest girl to the rim of the pit, where below them a bear, its fur matted and patchy, snuffles, glares up with pig eyes, then turns back to a box full of slop. Across the pit, 2 bears want the same the same pile of rotten meat, and they woof and roar, rise up, front paws clawing the putrid air until one drops down, moves off. While they were watching that, the bear below is climbed up from the pit, and right in front of them weaves its head from side to side, takes great sniffs. The father calmly says, "Just walk backwards, slowly, slowly." And the children, hearts racing, all obey as the nearest man edges closer for a shot, when so fast the children do not have time to step back on the feet they lifted last. The bear rushes at the man, swipes his camera from his hands, leaves them dripping blood, then ambles past. The children so still, and slides down into the stinking pit. Well, that's exactly how it once was at the garbage dump at Waskasiu. Jeff really nailed it there. Now I'd like to finish with another poem. This is called Remembering, for Geoffrey Ursell. Part 1, 1973. Back when I was chairman of the Writers Guild, you wanted to meet and dropped into the school at noon, a tall and bearded stranger who moved like a cat. But I had noon duty, so we patrolled the halls together, the kids staring, wondering who was this extra monitor so deep in conversation he paid them not the least attention. Finally, we settled in the gym, a wild floor hockey game raging. But we talked about fiction and poetry, discovered writers we both admired, suspecting already we might turn into friends. We had no idea then that you would write an award-winning novel, that your musicals would tour the province to much acclaim. No clue that with 2 others, we'd create a publishing company that would launch scores of new writers, win 3 Governor General's awards, and turn over 400 desperate dreams into actual books. Part 2, 2021. Shauna Powers phones for the CBC, wondering if I'll reminisce about you, your achievements, the kind of legacy you leave. Of course I will. We talk about your play that celebrates Sander Smerler's curling team, the surprise you felt decades after your books were published in Winnipeg when the BBC broadcast your poems from London and sent a check. The way you toiled over others' manuscripts, writing helpful comments when you saw a spark of skill, even for those who had to be rejected. Saturday morning, my wife and I sit on the sofa in pajamas, radio turned up, the interview about you, your skills as an editor, putting together 3 mass market paperbacks of Saskatchewan stories, a boost for young and old, such good memories. The discussion ending, Shauna switches to music from the archives, a song you wrote so many years ago, the bright red geranium waltz, your guitar, your voice filling the room. And suddenly, my wife and I embrace, cleaving fiercely together, desolate, because now we feel intensely what we only knew before, that we'll never hear your voice again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. That was a beautiful tribute. And feels like everybody should just breathe for a few moments to take in that poem and the reality that we will not, at least other than in a recording, hear Geoffrey's voice. And we have, though, tonight heard his voice through other people in a way. And at the moment, we have Barbara Sapergia with us. And I don't want to put Barbara on the spot, but I also don't want to presume that she might not want to say something. So I wonder if we can have Barbara come on the screen and see if there's anything she would like to say to, well, at least 60 people, probably more, signed up this evening to be part of this event. And if there's 2 people or 3 people at some screens, then there's quite a few more people than 60. And I see, I think I see Barbara's face is up there. Hi, Barbara. We'll just need you to turn your microphone on. It's in the bottom left corner. Yeah, you just press a little button that says, there, we've got you now.
That was on the right hand. Okay.
Oh, on the right hand for you, okay. So Barbara, it's, as we've said several times, it's really nice that you're able to be part of this with us. And I'll just give the screen over to you if you'd like to say a few words.
Very hard to know what to be said. The loss is so recent and so difficult, and I know it'll take a long time to deal with. But I'm very glad for the relationship that Geoffrey and I had for over 53 years. And that's what I'm going to remember. And when I start my next book, I will be thinking of him. Well, I'll be thinking of him all the time, but also trying to go on with the kind of things that we did. And I wish I could think of more useful things to say, but we did have very good times, and I'm very happy for it.
what you've said is just beautiful for this moment where we're at, all of us. And so thank you for speaking. Is there anything else?
Thanks for looking up all this interesting stuff that happened. There's more, mind you, but you could never get them all into one.
No, believe me, the time that we have is not nearly long enough to be able to really pay tribute to everything that Geoffrey and yourself have done in your creative lives and in your lives as community builders. But we're glad that we were able to do at least this evening.
Well, there were a lot of good, wonderful times.
Indeed, indeed.
And I appreciate the trouble that people have gone to create this.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Our pleasure. So there are some other people who would like to share some thoughts. And I understand that Jill Robinson will be the first person who'd like to share her tribute to Geoffrey. And I'll just sign off briefly.
Hi. Very nice to see you, Barbara, and very nice to hear the tributes from other people. The first time I met Barbara and Geoffrey was in October of 1993, when I flew to Saskatoon to give a reading at the Mayfair Library on 33rd Street. And it was a small gathering, but what I remember most about it was how Geoffrey and Barbara came up to me after the reading and welcomed me and complimented me on my reading. And that was so kind of them. And then when I moved to Saskatoon at Christmas time in December, they invited me and Stephen to have breakfast with them at Traeger's. And again, it was such a generous and thoughtful gesture. And really set the stage for me coming to love Saskatchewan and to call it home for the next 16 years. The following year, in 1995, Barbara and Geoffrey came over to our house in City Park on 9th Avenue, as did Daphne Marlett. And the five of us would sit around the fire reading Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans. And we passed the book around and each took turns. And it was remarkable because we realized that it was the kind of book that probably none of us would ever read on our own. So this was an opportunity to read a great work, to share camaraderie and in front of the fire. I remember I was in awe at first to be in the presence of and included with such illustrious writers. It was like being included in some kind of European salon. The following year, 1995, I became the editor of Grain magazine, taking over the post from Geoffrey. He'd held the post since 1990. I'll be eternally grateful to Geoffrey, for he offered me experienced and wise counsel. He was not pushy or directive, but he was always there to offer me advice, and he did voice his opinions clearly, and he was extremely knowledgeable and helpful about Saskatchewan writing, about production, and editing the magazine. He was patient and thoughtful and careful, which are traits that were seldom attributed to me. He had high standards and he implemented procedures unique to him that helped the magazine be the best that it could be. Even though his editorial vision was quite different from the one that Tim Connie and I shared, there was much he could and did teach me about running the magazine on every level, and I valued his advice greatly. For example, the attention to detail, to nuance, to everything. Every issue had to be read aloud from beginning to end, right to the bios, every single word before it went to press to catch any errors or omissions. And it was he, I believe, who established the practice that every Saskatchewan writer received more than a standard rejection slip. It was Geoffrey and Barbara who taught me this. Every time you get a grant, buy a piece of art. Not only will you have enough money at that point to do it, but also to pay back a little to support the arts in Saskatchewan. In subsequent years, we got together socially a few times when we were in town, had lunch at Calories, tea at McNally Robinson, and they came to Banff a couple of times to go to the Leighton Colony, staying in one of the studios with a grand piano for Geoffrey. As you know, Geoffrey had many talents and skills, including playing the piano, and he always asked and was terribly interested in how Emmett, our son's piano playing, was coming along. It wasn't just pleasantry with Geoffrey, he was genuinely interested. And I think the four of us always enjoyed each other's company. During the past year, I spoke on the phone to Barbara and Geoffrey a few times, but I greatly regret that I was never in Geoffrey's company again. You were a wonderful man, Geoffrey Ursell, and I'm so glad I knew you. And Barbara, I hope I see you again soon. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jill. That was lovely. And again, another window open to the lives of Geoffrey and to Barbara as well. Thank you for doing that. And we do have still a few moments before our hour is up. If there is anyone else who would like to join us on the screen and speak for a few moments, that would be just fine. If we don't hear from anyone through the chat in the next 30 seconds, we'll maybe assume that we're not going to be taken up on that invitation. I will thank folks who have been writing in the chat. I have been a bit busy, so I haven't been able to read everything, but I've glimpsed a few of your comments. And again, these are things we'll print out for Barbara, and they will also appear with the recording of this event that we hope other people will take advantage of seeing at a time that's more convenient for them than tonight might have been. So I don't think we have any more takers. So I think with that in mind, that we're coming to a close, I'd like to once again thank the Writers Guild and Sask Books for making this event possible. And you can tell people to search out the video through the Saskatchewan Writers Guild's website. I'm sure there will be links there that will help you navigate find your way to it. I want to thank our panelists who were again Bob Currie and Nik Burton, David Carpenter and Faye Rafter. And I want to thank all of you who took some time this evening to be with us in person, sort of, in spirit, certainly. And when we see one another on the street, we can say, I know that you were at the event because I saw your name in the chat box, or I saw you on the screen, and we had this time together for at least a little while to remember our dear friend, Geoffrey Ursell. And so with that, I guess we'll sign off. We will wish everyone a safe life right now. We're still all a little bit antsy about how things will go with the pandemic. We want everyone to stay healthy, and we want Barbara to go in peace. And we are thinking of you, Barbara, and the many months and years ahead of you without your dear Geoffrey. And we will hopefully all be able to get together and see one another for a reading or something literary in the not too distant future. So thank you again for being here, and I will say good night.